serve up the whole thing. And it's a story by Italo Calvino called Theft in a Cake Shop. And I'm hoping you're going to find it rather delicious, as I did. Okay, are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. When Dritto got to the place they were to meet, the others had already been waiting some time. There were two of them, Baby and Uwara Uwara. The street was so silent that the ticking of the clocks could be heard in the houses. "Come on," said Dritto. "Where to?" they asked. But Dritto was never one to explain about any job he was going to do. "Come on now," he replied. And he walked along in silence through streets empty as dry rivers, with the moon following them along the tram lines. Dritto ahead, gazing round with those yellow, restless eyes of his, and moving his nostrils as if they were smelling something peculiar. Baby was called that because he had a big head like a newborn baby and a stumpy body. He was all muscle and moved so softly he might have been a cat. There was no one like him at climbing up walls and squeezing through openings, and Dritto always had good reason to take him along. "Will it be a good job?" Dritto asked Baby. "If we bring it off," answered Dritto, a reply which didn't mean much. Meanwhile, by a devious route which only he knew, he had led them round a corner into a yard. The other two soon realised they were going to work on the back of a shop, and Uwara Uwara pushed ahead in case he was left as lookout. It always fell to Uwara Uwara to be the lookout man. He longed to break into houses, search around and fill his pockets like the others, but he always found himself standing on guard on cold street, in danger from police patrols, his teeth chattering in the cold and chain smoking to calm his nerves. He was an emaciated Sicilian, Uwara Uwara, with a sad mulatto face and wrists jutting out of his sleeves. When on a job, he always dressed up in his best, God knows why, complete with hat, tie and raincoat, and if forced to run for it, he'd snatch up the ends of his raincoat as if spreading wings. "Your lookout, Uwara Uwara," said Dritto, dilating his nostrils. Uwara Uwara went off quietly. He knew Dritto and the danger signal of those dilating nostrils, which would move quicker and quicker until they suddenly stopped, and he whipped out a revolver. "There," Dritto said to Baby. He pointed to a little window high off the ground, covered with a piece of cardboard in place of a broken pane. "You climb up, get in, and open for me," he said. "Take care not to put on the lights as they'll be seen from outside." Baby pulled himself up on the smooth wall like a monkey, pushed in the cardboard without a sound, and stuck his head through. It was then that he became aware of the smell. He took a deep breath, and up through his nostrils wafted an aroma of freshly baked cakes. It gave him a feeling of shy excitement, of remote tenderness. "Oh, what a load of cakes there must be in here," he thought. It was years since he had eaten a proper bit of cake, not since before the war, perhaps. He jumped down into the darkness, kicked against a telephone, got a broomstick up his trouser leg, and then hit the ground. The smell of cakes was stronger than ever, but he couldn't tell where it was coming from. He reached out a hand, trying to feel his way in the dark, so as to reach the door and open it for Dritto. Quickly, he recoiled in horror. He must be face to face with some animal, some soft, slimy sea thing, perhaps. He stood there with his hand in the air, a hand that had suddenly become damp and sticky, as if covered with leprosy. Between the fingers had sprouted something round and soft, an excrescence, a tumour, perhaps. He strained his eyes in the dark, but could see nothing, not even when he put his hand under his nose. But he could smell, even though he could not see, and he burst out laughing. He realised he had touched a tart and was holding a blob of cream and a crystallised cherry. At once, he began licking the hand and groping around with the other at the same time. It touched something solid but soft, with a thin covering of fine sugar. A doughnut. Still groping, he popped the whole of it into his mouth and gave a little cry of pleasure on discovering it had jam inside. It really was the most wonderful place. Whatever way he stretched his hand out in the darkness, it found new kinds of cakes. aware of an impatient knocking on a door nearby. It was Dritto waiting to be let in. Baby moved towards the sound and his hands bumped first into a meringue and then into an almond cake. He opened the door and Dritto's torch lit upon his little face with its moustaches already white with cream. "It's full of cakes here," exclaimed Baby as if the other didn't know. "This isn't a time for cakes," said Dritto, pushing him aside. "We've got to hurry." And he went ahead, twisting the beam of his torch round in the dark. Everywhere it touched, it lit upon rows of shelves, and on the shelves rows of trays, and on the trays rows of cakes of every conceivable shape and colour, tarts filled with cream glittering like candle wax, and piles of sugar-coated buns and castles of almond cakes. It was then that a terrible worry came over Baby, the worry of not having time to eat all he wanted, of being forced to make his escape before he had sampled all the different kinds of cakes, of having all this land of milk and honey at his disposal only for a few minutes in his whole life. And the more cakes he discovered, the more his anxiety increased, and every new corner and every fresh view of the shop that was lit up by Dritto's torch seemed to be about to shut off forever. He flung himself on the shelves, choking himself with cakes, cramming 2 or 3 inside his mouth at a time, without even tasting them. He seemed to be battling with the cakes, as if they were threatening enemies, strange monsters besieging him, a crisp and sticky siege which he must break through by the force of his jaw. The slit halves of the big sugared buns seemed to be opening yellow throats and eyes at him, the cream horns to be blossoming like flowers of carnivorous plants. For a horrible moment, Baby had the feeling that it was he who was being devoured by the cakes. Dritto pulled him by the arm. "The till," he said. "We've got to open the till." At the same time as he passed, he stuffed a piece of multicoloured sponge into his mouth, a cherry off a tartan, and then a brioche, hurriedly, as if anxious not to be distracted from the job on hand. He had switched off his torch. They had now reached the front of the cake shop with its showcases and marbled top counters. Now the moment had come to force the till. "Hold this," said Dritto, handing the torch to Baby with the beam pointing downwards so it couldn't be seen from outside. But Baby was holding the torch with one hand and groping around with the other. He seized an entire plum cake, and while Dritto was busy at the lock with his tools, began chewing it as if it were a loaf of bread. But he soon tired of it and left it half-eaten on the marble slab. "Get away from there! Look what a filthy mess you're making," hissed Dritto through clenched teeth. In spite of his trade, he had a strange respect for tidy work. Then he, too, couldn't resist the temptation and stuffed 2 biscuits, the kind that were half sponge and half chocolate, into his mouth without interrupting his work. Now, Baby, in order to have both hands free, had constructed a kind of lampshade from tray cloths and pieces of nougat. He then espied some large cakes with "Happy Birthday" written on them. He moved round them, studying the plan of attack. First, he reviewed them with a finger and licked off a bit of chocolate cream. Then, he buried his face inside and began biting them from the middle one by one. But he still felt a kind of frenzy which he did not know how to satisfy. He could not discover any way of enjoying everything completely. Now he was crouching on all fours over a table laden with tarts. He would have liked to lie down in those tarts, cover himself with them, and never have to leave them. But 5 or 10 minutes from now it would all be over. For the rest of his life, cake shops would be out of bounds to him again, forever, like when he was a child squashing his nose against the window pane. If only at least he could stay there 3 or 4 hours. "Dritto," he exclaimed, "suppose we hide here till dawn. Who'll see us?" "Don't be a fool," said Dritto, who had now succeeded in forcing the till and was searching round among the notes. "We've got to get out of here before the cops arrive." Just at that moment, they heard a knock on the window. In the dim moonlight, Uwara could be seen knocking on the blind and making signs to them. The 2 in the shop gave a jump, but Uwara motioned to them to keep calm and for Baby to come out and take his place so that he could come in. The other 2 shook their fists and showed their teeth at him and made signs for him to get away from the front of the shop if he didn't want his brains blown out. Dritto, however, had only found a few thousand lire in the till and was cursing and blaming Baby for not trying to help him. But Baby seemed beside himself. He was biting into doughnuts, picking at raisins, licking syrups, plastering himself, all over and leaving sticky marks on the showcases and counters. He found that he no longer had any desire for cakes. In fact, a feeling of nausea was beginning to creep up from the pit of his stomach, but he refused to believe it. He simply could not give up yet. Dritto was now cursing and swearing at the lock on another till, forgetful of cakes and hunger. Suddenly, from the back of the shop appeared Uwara Uwara, swearing in his Sicilian dialect, which was quite unintelligible to either of them. "The cops?" they asked, already pale. "Change of guard! Change of guard!" Uwara Uwara was croaking in his dialect, trying hard to explain how unjust it was to leave him starving out in the cold while they guzzled cakes inside. "Go back and keep guard! Go back! Keep guard!" shouted Baby angrily, the nausea from having eaten too much making him feel savage and selfish. Dritto knew that it was only fair to Uwara Uwara to make the change, but he also knew that Baby would not be convinced so easily, and without someone on guard they couldn't stay. So he pulled out his revolver and pointed it at Uwara Uwara. "Back to your post at once, Uwara Uwara," he said. Desperately, Uwara Uwara thought of getting some supplies before leaving. He gathered a small pile of little almond cakes with nuts on them in his big hands. "And suppose they catch you with your hands full of cakes, you fool. What do you tell them?" Dritto swore at him. "Leave them all there and get out." Uwara Uwara burst into tears. Baby felt he hated him. He picked up a cake with "Happy Birthday" written on it and flung it in his face. Uwara Uwara could easily have avoided it, instead of which he stuck his face out to get the full force, then burst out laughing as his face, hat and tie were all covered in cream cake. Off he went, licking himself right up to his nose and cheeks. At last, Dritto succeeded in forcing the till and was stuffing all the notes he could find into his pocket, cursing because they stuck to his jammy fingers. "Come on, Baby, time to go," he said. But Baby could not leave just like that. This was the feast to be talked over for years to come, with his cronies and with Tuscan Mary. Tuscan Mary was Baby's girlfriend. She had long, smooth legs and a face and body that were almost horse-like. Baby liked her because he could curl himself up and wind round her like a cat. Uwara Uwara's second entry interrupted the course of these thoughts. Dritto quickly pulled out his revolver, but Uwara Uwara shouted, "The cops!" and rushed off, flapping the ends of his raincoat. Dritto gathered up the last few notes and was at the door in a couple of leaps, and Baby behind. Baby was still thinking of Tuscan Mary, and it was then that he remembered he might have taken her some cakes. He never gave her a present, and she might make a scene about it. He went back, snatched up some cream rolls, thrust them under his shirt, then, quickly thinking that he had chosen the most fragile ones, looked around for something more solid and stuffed those into his bosom too. At that moment, he saw the shadows of police moving on the window, waving their arms and pointing at something at the end of the street, and one of them aimed a revolver in that direction and fired. Baby squatted down behind a counter. The shot did not seem to have hit its target. Now they were making angry gestures and peering inside the shop. Now the shop was teeming with armed policemen. Baby remained crouched there, but meanwhile he found some candied fruit within arm's reach and chewed at slivers of citron and bergamot to calm his nerves. The police had now discovered the theft and also found the remains of half-eaten cakes on the shelves, and so, distractedly, they too began to nibble little cakes that were lying around, taking care, though, to leave the traces of the thieves. After a few moments, becoming more enthusiastic in their search for evidence, they were all eating away heartily. Baby was chewing, but the others were chewing even more loudly and drowned the sound. All of a sudden, he felt a thick liquid oozing up from between his skin and his shirt, and a mounting nausea from his stomach. He was so dizzy with candied fruit that it was some time before he realised that the way to the door was free. The police described later how they had seen a monkey with its nose plastered with cream swing across the shop, overturning trays and tarts, and how by the time they had recovered from their amazement and cleared the tarts from under their feet, he had escaped. When Baby got to Tuscan Mary's and opened his shirt, he found his whole chest covered with a strange sticky paste. And they stayed till morning, he and she, lying on the bed, licking and picking at each other till they had finished the last crumb of cake and blob of cream. Well, you can see why I didn't want to chop any bits off. I love the birthday cake, and it kind of ties in with Choco Fight. I do.